This paper is a version of a paper I wrote for a conference at the University of Nanterre in France, which was celebrating its 50th anniversary, just like Warwick. And they had a theme of contingency. So there is a contingent event that this paper came out of, a paper on contingency, but contingency is not really contingent to what the paper's about. But I start off with a bit of contingency, and that is the historical origin of that. It's not entirely gratuitous. So I'll start. Early on in the New Spirit, the first of John Ashbery's 3 poems, we find this passage, and everything I put up there I'll read through, because you don't have to try and read it while you listen to me. If it is a passage, because there's really no clear, obvious reason or place to start or to cut this as the way I've cut it. The poem doesn't really allow for that. So this is what I did. Nevertheless, storms do occur. It would be inconceivable for the progression to pursue its course unmolested, since it is a progression, for it not to be narrowed down to that single moment of grabbing you and shaking you mercilessly, nor that this moment become the practical meaning of the pattern of events, thus to be terminated, sadder and wiser, drawing the rueful lesson from experience. And yet it was an accident, wasn't it? Not just the part where everything went haywire, but the whole thing. A series of accidents, complete in themselves, and as components fitting into one big accident? There would be nothing very encouraging about this either, except that our shared apprehending of the course as plotted turns it into a way, something like an old country road. We can stop. We have stopped. We are stopping now, turning to look into the fulfillment that each unconsciously exhibits to the other, without wanting to especially, or knowing too much about it. This possibility of fulfillment creates the appetite for itself, with the result that the dislocations come through to us as romantic episodes or chapters. There's the one in which I fell away gradually, without even realizing it until we were already far apart, separated by new habits and preoccupations that had arisen even as we sat close to each other, talking about the weather and so on. To have the whole outline in mind, yet not notice the individual changes as they occur. And then one day it dawns on you that you are the change. So naturally, you could have seen it coming. What we have here is a long, gentle, punchline-less joke about contingency that consistently posits and undoes suggestions of necessity and plan. Consider terms like progression, pattern of events, or how dislocations are transformed into romantic episodes or chapters, or that the whole outline is available to the mind. Against this, the poem equally unobtrusively suggests randomness, contingency, or to use its vocabulary, the accidental. And yet it was an accident, wasn't it? Hinting that the way the series of events become a way, something like an old country road, or the dislocations get fitted into chapters, hinting that this is nothing other than a willful repression of the accident, an attempt to contain the unassimilable anarchy of what happens for no reason. However, the wittiest part of all in this ostentatious display of cleverness is the dialectical recuperation of accident itself. Not just the part where everything went haywire, but the whole thing, a series of accidents complete in themselves, and as components fitting into one big accident. The point being that by definition, an accident can never be complete in itself, and that once accidents are seen as components fitting into one big accident, they are precisely no longer accidental, but integral parts of a larger coherent process. This intellectually madcap run through a hoary philosophy is worthy of Beckett, but if Ashbery might be seen as parodying here Wallace Stevens's blessed rage for order, what also interests me in this context is his reticence to unproblematically valorize the accident, and his clear tolerance for and interest in the tendency to create meaningful order out of randomness. That is, Ashbery's lack of concern that you are the change, so naturally you could have seen it coming. Ashbery is surely not on the side of the Eleatic mythical method and its imperative to create order out of chaos, but neither is his position an immanentist assertion of the unmediated event, in which the break in the system, any system, becomes a guarantor of authenticity and presence. In this way, I'd like to suggest Ashbery is part of a larger post-surrealist suspicion of that movement's valorization of chance. Notably, precisely among movements and figures who are heavily indebted to surrealism themselves. That is, this suspicion of surrealist valorization of chance. For example, in a discussion with Andrew Payne about the chance-generated writing of Jackson McClough and John Cage, Steve McCaffrey remarks, where McClough's work, as to Cage's own misostic workings of Joyce and Thoreau, is most vulnerable to critique, is in the danger of a fetishization of chance procedure, which tends to reinscribe meaning into textual economy as a kind of eventist mana. In McCaffrey's view, then, the fetishization of the meaningless can sometimes serve only to contain it by giving it a meaning as such, while also by contrast obscuring the loss, dispersal, and randomness inherent to forms of writing which do not explicitly disavow intention and choice. This form of chance at once reifies something that now becomes seen as its opposite, meaning, intention, what have you, while positing a recuperative meaningfulness of even the most radical randomness. And this militates against the idea of radical loss, which underpins McCaffrey's view of signifying structures as general economies in Bataille's sense. According to McCaffrey, chance here becomes no more than an investment in meaning, the most radically dangerous and unlikely one, and thus, ultimately, meaning's greatest ally. Still closer to surrealism would be the Situationists, who insisted that their position with regard to chance was in fact a crucial dividing line between their practices and surrealist ones, which could seem very similar. Now, the Situationists most certainly did valorize the contingent as integral to their project, knowing full well that such a commitment, if fully adhered to, could not help but destroy art as ideality entirely, which was their goal. Guy Debord stresses this, for example, in his early text, Report on the Construction of Situations from 1957. There is our entire program, which is essentially ephemeral. Our situations will be without a future. They will be places where people are constantly coming and going. The unchanging nature of art, or of anything else, does not enter into our considerations, which are in earnest. The idea of eternity is the basest one a man could conceive of regarding his acts. As proposed here, a situation is nothing if not contingent. But note how the very next year in his theory of the dérive, while continuing to stress the contingent, Debord is explicitly wary of chance, le hasard, which he explicitly links to defects in surrealist practice. While noting that chance is a significant element in the designedly random strolls which constitute the dérive, Debord also claims that it is, quote, a less important factor than one might think. He goes on to assert that the importance chance does have arises mainly from the fact that psychogeographic observation, his term, is still finding its footing. And Debord observes, but chance naturally acts in a conservative manner, and in a new framework tends to reduce everything to the alternation between a limited number of variants and to habit. He then explicitly attacks surrealism for its lack of understanding of this factor. An insufficient suspicion of chance and its always reactionary ideological use condemned to dismal failure the famous aimless stroll undertaken in 1923 by 4 surrealists, starting from a town chosen at random. Wandering through the desolate countryside is obviously depressing, and the play of chance is more impoverished there than ever. As Vincent Kaufmann puts it, not an inconsiderable part, did I put this on a slide? I don't think I did, no. As Kaufmann puts it, very good writer on situationism, by the way, not an inconsiderable part of the theory of the dérive is devoted to explaining that although the dérive is to some extent a bet against chance, chance is not the key element. On the contrary, the dérive entails a preliminary determination of environments, the possibility of calculating them, of establishing some form of objective understanding. And Kaufmann goes on to argue that according to Debord, the surrealists' fetishization of chance, along with the unconscious, rendered them too passive and too subjective and unable to achieve the objective analyses which situationism strove for. I think this is largely right, but I also want to stress that for Debord, the problem is that chance in the surrealist sense is never random enough. On the contrary, it always reveals itself as determined by law, hence the limited number of alternations to which it leads. And thus, to turn oneself over to chance is in fact to turn oneself over to a hidden order, which also goes by the name of habit. Surrealist chance, then, to use Debord's term, is conservative, and therefore a principle of constancy to be opposed to the ephemerality to which situationism aspires. In short, in Debord's analysis, the surrealist version of chance can be no more than a reification of the current laws governing the everyday, not a durable breaching or transforming of them. While ostensibly valorizing chance, for Debord, the surrealists are actually destroying its possibility. The implication of Debord's critique would seem to be that chance isn't something one finds or stumbles upon, but rather chance is something that one must actively construct. This is a voluntarist notion of chance, something we'll come back to. Okay, on into a more explicitly psychoanalytic register. The sense of the containment or abrogation of chance in the random, even in a context which in some way valorizes it, is a problem that British psychoanalyst Adam Phillips raises in his essay Contingency for Beginners. By way of a case history, in the first section of this essay, Phillips suggests that the question of the relationship to contingency, in his words, recognition of one's life turning on a series of accidents in time, of events beyond one's power. Phillips suggests that the question of the relationship to contingency has received too little attention in psychoanalytic theory. Indeed, Phillips proposes that the emphasis on object relations in developmental theory might be read as a defense against this other problem. As Phillips puts it, given the obvious contingency of much of our lives, we do not, in any meaningful sense, intend or choose our birth, our parents, our bodies, our language, our culture, our thoughts, our dreams, our desires, our death, and so on. It might be worth considering, from a psychoanalytic point of view, not only our relationships to ourselves and our relationships to objects, but our relationship to accidents. Not surprisingly, at this point, Phillips turns to how Freud viewed the question and makes a crucial point. That if Freud devoted an entire book to accidents, the psychopathology of everyday life, which Phillips calls the mistake book, the thrust of Freud's argument therein is precisely to remove the accidental from the accident. As is well known, through an astonishing collection of brilliant interpretations, Freud shows that errors, mistakes, slips, and lapses, which might have seemed utterly random events of misfortune or debility, are in fact meaning-laden compromised formations dictated by the unconscious and not classically accidental in the least. As Phillips puts it, in psychoanalytic theory, and especially in this book, In psychoanalytic theory, bodies were bled of their contingency. And in the Mistake book, Phillips says, Freud describes a large number of accidents to prove that there is no such thing as an accident. Therefore, Phillips concludes, Freudian interpretation aims to extend the realm of intention and diminish the empire of contingency. The last section of Phillips's essay takes as its epigraph a quotation from John Cage. Cage writing, "Something has to be done to get us free of our memories and choices." And this last section, in this last section, Phillips gives himself the task of writing the relationship to chance into Winnicottian models of infantile development. I'm not going to talk about that, and I don't think Winnicott is really the presiding intellectual spirit of this essay. Because the most pressing of Phillips's questions come up in a series, the most pressing of his issues come up in a series of questions which keep returning and revolving around the same problem. For example, one quote from Phillips, "Why is it so difficult for us to believe, to live confidently as if our lives are subject to accident?" 2, that our lives might be simply a series or collection of coincidences seems peculiarly unacceptable. 3, what kinds of defense blind one to coincidence? And especially convincing piece of evidence here is this sentence, "The contingent self enjoins us to imagine a life without blaming, a life exempt from the languages of effort and self-control." Astonishingly, he can write all 4 of these sentences in this essay and never once write the name of Nietzsche. I mean, what could be more Nietzschean than those questions, in fact? Go figure. What interests me most in his essay, however, then, is where, rather than turning to the developmental model of object relations, Phillips attempts to open a space within Freudian metapsychology for the contingent, to give a little room to what Freud's brilliant work on the omnipresence of unconscious desire can close down. Here, Phillips suggests that in addition to the self of unconscious desire that knows what it wants and is always wanting, that's the Freudian self, in addition to that, we need to imagine a different self, not defensive, indeed radically undefended, a self which, for Phillips, lives its contingency without contesting it. But of this potentially liberating contingent self, Phillips posits an important caveat. But in certain environments, this version of the self can only be lived either as despair, the contingent self. My life is out of my control and that's what's wrong with it, or as skepticism. I don't know what I want, and therefore doubt my capacity to know anything, because I'm free from that unconscious self which is always wanting and knowing what it wants. We seem to remain within a largely Nietzschean problematic. How to affirm the reality of the meaningless without falling into nihilism? Or how to affirm what is beyond the power of the will without reframing this outside as a newly localized unconscious will? I'd like to take these considerations as a frame to talk about the universities now, and the rest of the paper will be largely about that, particularly May 68, and which really in some ways began at the University of Nanterre, and also things that happened at the University of Warwick in 1970 which need to be read in the context of May 68 and other contexts, and other related protests. Starting with Nanterre, what are the chances, what is the likelihood that a student protest over local issues at a newly founded suburban university on the outskirts of Paris would lead to a general national insurrection which almost brought down the French government, and which remains the most significant revolutionary moment of capitalist Western Europe in the last half of the 20th century. To what extent is the relationship of Nanterre to May 68 one of simple contingency? Was May 68 itself simply, as Ashbery might have put it, one big accident? Or, as Maurice Blanchot suggests in La Communauté Inavouable, is it of the very essence of the singularity of May 68 that in some ways it has to be thought of as not having happened? To a considerable extent, these are questions that were being asked at the time and in the immediate aftermath as well. And the whole problem of the causality behind political action, as well as of its finality, was central. In this connection, one of the more famous bits of graffiti of the day, but also one of the most complex in its implications, was Les structures ne descendent pas dans la rue, which was apparently written on a blackboard inside the Sorbonne during the May 68 occupation. That is, structures don't take to the streets. On the one hand, as Elisabeth Roudinesco and others have pointed out, in the run-up to 1968, structuralism was largely associated with left-wing and anti-establishment thought, exemplified above all by Althusser, Barthes, and Foucault. And at this time, structuralist thought was most certainly unwelcome in the French university establishment, at whose center, ironically, this graffito was written. Note that in 1968, neither Althusser, Barthes, Foucault, nor Derrida had positions in a French university and wouldn't have been allowed to have positions in a French university. They were all in strange parallel structures which exist in France. It's important to understand how the university works as a function of the state. And so it's quite ironic that this piece of graffiti was written inside the Sorbonne, occupied by left-wing students. This irony finds its explanation, however, in the fact that other important elements of the radical left contested structuralism, denouncing it as an ideology which necessarily downplayed the role of conscious choice and decision-making as a source of action. Sherry Turkle, in a really interesting book about psychoanalysis and May 68, not a psychoanalytic interpretation of it, but about the role psychoanalysis as an intellectual movement played. Sherry Turkle asserts that "Down with Structuralism" became a student slogan in '68, and she discusses how more generally structuralist premises were seen as, quote, antithetical in spirit to the voluntarist flavor of the May uprising, which asserted the primacy of desires and ideas. Indeed, among the leading participants of '68, the Situationists were very decided opponents of structuralism, which Guy Debord had attacked in The Society of the Spectacle, published just the year before, in 1967. There, Debord somewhat predictably dismisses structuralism as a form of ahistorical reification. Structuralism's anti-historical thinking takes as its perspective the eternal presence of a system which was never created and will never come to an end. Moreover, and more suggestively, Debord argues that the emphasis that structuralism places on codes is only an outgrowth and symptom of the forms of mediation inherent to the society of the spectacle, rather than a transhistorical universal tool for analyzing them. So when structuralism talks about codes, it shows that it's a symptom of the society of the spectacle, not that it's in a position to analyze it. That's Debord's argument, which he makes in several places in the Society of the Spectacle. But if the question of structuralism was at the heart of the events of May, then the phrase, "structures don't take to the streets," also had an extremely interesting afterlife beyond that month. On February 22nd, 1969, 7-8 months later, in the discussion that followed Michel Foucault's rather famous talk, "What is an Author?" Right? The first time he presented this piece of research at a talk, there was a talk and there was a panel to discuss it. And so in the panel discussion after his talk, "What is an Author?", the philosopher Lucien Goldman produced that famous Sorbonne slogan as evidence to argue against Foucault that people, not structures, made history. And he talks specifically, he says it's important to remember that the structures don't take to the streets. This was written in the Sorbonne in the May 68 occupation, and so he takes that to argue against what he considers to be Foucault's structuralism. Another intellectual in attendance that night, however, was Jacques Lacan, who responded to Goldman's criticism of Foucault as follows. I do not believe it is in any way legitimate to write that structures don't take to the streets, because if there's one thing that the events of May have shown, it is precisely the taking to the streets of structures. And the fact that this phrase was written at the very site where such a thing took place proves nothing except what is so often, and even most often, integral to what one calls the act, that this act misrecognizes itself. Rather brilliant piece of Lacan. Now, if Lacan is usually read here as speaking as a psychoanalyst, it's hard to imagine a somewhat orthodox Marxist saying anything radically different. For classical Marxism, the meaningful motors of major historical change will have to be the contradictions or evolutions of a particular material system. From either the psychoanalytic or historical materialist perspective, such a paradigm can be seen as a strict determinism which absolutely recuses the principle of chance in favor of pattern or law. And when Lacan speaks of the act that is unable to recognize itself, he situates himself on the terrain of Freud's psychopathology of everyday life, whose totalitarian hermeneutics worry Adam Phillips, as we've seen. Right? You know, that's the psychopathology of everyday life. You know, the perfect parapraxis is to say structures don't take to the streets when you're in the middle of showing that they do. You know. Lacan again seems to be arguing against contingency. But Lacan's affirmation can also be read from a different perspective, that of the acting subject itself, viewed as source and center of its choices. In this light, we see that in comparison to the Sartrean voluntarist existentialism which dominated much of the ideology of '68, and interesting intellectual histories point out that May '68 was Sartre's big comeback. He'd been sort of put in the shadows by structuralism for about a decade, and he came back into fashion in '68. So we can see that in comparison to the Sartrean voluntarist existentialism, which dominated much of the ideology of '68, Lacan actually adds to or reinforces contingency, suggesting that the subject's understanding of itself and its acts is in some way contingent on the greater forces at work at any particular moment. The argument that history is not dependent on individual conscious volition certainly opens a space for certain forms of contingency in relation to subjective experience. And were one to extend Lacan's witticism as far as to suggest that structures write books and compose music, we would have a solution to John Cage's problem as cited by Phillips. Something has to be done to get us free of our memories and choices. From the psychoanalytic perspective of Freud's Copernican revolution, being free of our choices is not a big problem. The debate between Goldman and Lacan, then, seems not an argument between contingency and destiny, but rather about where to situate the essential. But if 1968 demonstrated structures taking to the streets, one reason that this happened is that other structures had already taken to the universities and the classrooms, and not only or even primarily in France. In the chapter of the Society of the Spectacle devoted to culture, Guy Debord discusses how culture become merchandise, and culture in the broader French sense, which is a little closer to what we'd say by media also, or the knowledge industry. Culture become merchandise must of necessity go on to become the leading consumer good of the society of the spectacle. In pursuing his argument, de Boer refers to the estimations and predictions of Clark Kerr, whom he dubs one of the most advanced ideologues of this school regarding the economic weight, role, and future of the knowledge industry in the United States. Clark Kerr, of course, was the chancellor of the University of California system and a key administrative player in the conflicts with the free speech movement at the University of California Berkeley campus in 1964 and 1965. But here, de Boer is referring explicitly to Kerr's extremely influential work in 1963, The Uses of the University, which were based on Kerr's Godkin lectures at Harvard, delivered earlier that year. De Boer doesn't quote Kerr directly, but the statistics he mentions and the content he summarizes makes it easy to find exactly the passage from Kerr he had in mind. And there, in The Uses of the University, Clark Kerr writes that the universities new, by which he means, speaking of universities new, he means post-war imbrication with the industrial sector, makes the university a prime instrument of national purpose. This is new. This is the essence of the transformation now engulfing our universities. Basic to this transformation is the growth of the knowledge industry, which is coming to permeate government and business. And then right after that, in Kerr's original text, are the main elements of the passage which de Boer translates and summarizes right in the middle of the Society of the Spectacle. Clark Kerr writes, "The production, distribution, and consumption of knowledge in all its forms is said to account for 29% of gross national product. What the railroads did for the second half of the last century, that is the 19th, and what the automobile did for the first half of this century may be done for the second half of this century by the knowledge industry." Now, for de Boer, structuralism as ideology and practice is one of the leading complicit symptoms of the knowledge industry. Do I have a slide here for that? No, I don't. De Boer writes, "Structuralism is a body of thought that comes guaranteed by the state. It takes the present conditions of spectacular communication for an absolute." For de Boer, to some extent, the success of structuralism is proof that Kerr is right, that the university now plays a new role in the production, distribution, and consumption of knowledge. Now, just 3 years later, and across the channel, Clark Kerr's vision would also be a leading target of a Marxist critique of the modern university, though one coming from a very different intellectual tradition. And now I'm talking about something familiar to many of you, the work done by a group of students and lecturers working under the guidance of E.P. Thompson right here at the University of Warwick, which, like Nanterre, was the locus of an important student revolt, though one which did not shake the British state to its very foundations. The events that came to a head in 1970, like many of those that occurred throughout French universities in 67 and 68, the events began with what might seem like trivial questions over quality of student life. And that was true in France too. Warwick students wanted a student union building of their own, under their own control, something to which the administration was adamantly opposed. Most of you probably know the rest of the story. Students occupied the administrative building. They found confidential files which revealed examples of what we might call bad practice at the University of Warwick among the central administration, including the use of a private detective to ascertain whether a visiting American professor of labor relations could be deported for having fomented labor unrest by speaking to a local automotive workers' union. Letters from headmasters of high schools successfully urging the then Vice Chancellor of Warwick not to accept applicants who had been politically active at their schools. Other secret forms of cooperation with local authorities and the local barons of industry. When the occupiers tried to go public with their findings, they were met with the full power of the university's legal arm. And at the heart of the affair were attempts by both the university community and the local and national press to subvert or defy injunctions against publishing the discovered documents. So in the midst of all of this, E.P. Thompson and a collective put together the book Warwick University Ltd., which has been reprinted and re-released, and remains to this day an authoritative account of the new British model of the corporate university, of which Warwick remains a leading exemplar. The book not only discusses the scandal of the secret files and the university's subsequent attempt to stifle their dissemination, but as I mentioned, it talks about the complicity with local barons of industry, and the Warwick Group saw this complicity with industry as being at the heart of the conflict of 1970, and here's from that book, Warwick University Ltd., here's a statement from the collective. And Clark Kerr reappears. One prime social function of a university is to inquire freely and to criticize freely. And the more managed, the more planned, the more efficient the rest of society grows, the more important this function becomes. One of the pervasive myths of the mid-20th century is that with the replacement of the old-style entrepreneur and tycoon by the propertyless manager, there has come about a qualitative change to managerial capitalism. The new manager is seen as running the system in the national interest, impact, rather than in the interests of the property class. Where does the university fit into this picture? Professor Clark Kerr, who ran the Berkeley campus, that's not exactly true. He was the chancellor of the whole system, but he stepped in when there was the crisis at Berkeley. Professor Clark Kerr, who ran the Berkeley campus of the University of California, where many have located the origins of the student movement, answered this question in his book, The Uses of the University. The university provides skilled manpower and facilities for basic research, and it produces the culture and ideology of the pluralist system. But the world of industry is emphatically not a world of a neutral technocracy working for the benefit of all. The institution described here by the collective is one that Kerr, in an attempt at wit, had dubbed the multiversity in this book that both Guy Debord and E.P. Thompson refer to. By multiversity, Kerr meant the new institution torn in several directions by various forces whose interests could no longer be seen to be aligned. No longer an organism, as in older views, that's Kerr's word, the new university is a mechanism. I quote Kerr, "The new university is a mechanism, a series of processes producing a series of results, a mechanism held together by administrative rules and powered by money." Kerr retains a responsibly critical position towards the multiversity throughout his discussion of it. He always said, I never said I was for it, I was just describing it. But in an ideological maneuver that both Debord and E.P. Thompson would have easily unmasked, while professing to be critical of the multiversity, he presents it quite simply as an inevitability. Kerr writes, "The multiversity has its reality rooted in the logic of history. It is an imperative rather than a reasoned choice among elegant alternatives." Right? We all know this. There is no alternative. We all know what's wrong with the multiversity, but there it is. History demands it. What can we do? Don't ask me, right? In light of this, Kerr ruefully suggests the idea of a multiversity has no bard to sing its praises. Now I'm moving on to the final section, and I will say, well, Kerr was only half right. If the multiversity had no bard to sing its praises, it quickly found one to denounce its faults in the form of the eminently bardic poet Robert Duncan, in his poem, The Multiversity, Passages 21, which he wrote at the height of the free speech movement in Berkeley, probably November 1964. Like Debord and Thompson, Duncan seems to at least have had a glance at the book, The Uses of the University. In that book, Kerr writes, "It is sometimes said that the American multiversity president is a two-faced character. This is not so. If he were, he could not survive. He is a many-faced character, in the sense that he must face in many directions at once, while contriving to turn his back on no important group. I can't help but think Duncan had that passage in mind in his opening lines. Not men, but heads of the Hydra, his false faces in which authority lies, hired minds of private interests over us here. Kerr, behind him, heads of the Bank of America, the Tribune, that's the Oakland Tribune, the local newspaper, which was quite reactionary. Heads of usury, heads of war, the worm's mouthpiece spreads what it wishes its own. As even these lines are sufficient to indicate, Duncan's idiom will be eminently Poundian. We have usury here. As he continues to list the lies of the university administrators, that's the pressure on that word lies there. As he continues to list the lies of the university's administrators, he'll also make occasional reference to Blake. Blake and Pound are his models here in many ways. One of Duncan's concerns will be the hidden community, his term, which he claims the administrators deny when they allege that only a tiny number of students are involved in the protests. And that's the beginning of the poem. It's about 3 pages, and the poem ends like this. Evil, referred to the root of up, over, simulacra of law that would overrule the law man's inner nature seeks, coils about them, not men, but heads and armors of the worm. Office is, there being no common good, no commune, no communion, outside the freedom of individual volition. These somewhat mysterious lines can receive some elucidation from Duncan's HD book, where Duncan mentions the same etymology of evil and defines it this way. Evil is power over us of outer or inner compulsion. As the power and presumption of authority by the state has increased in every nation, we are ill with it, for it surrounds us, and where it does not openly conscript, and he's thinking of obligatory military service in Vietnam, that word conscript has that weight, where it does not openly conscript, seeks by advertising, by education, by dogma, or by terror, to seduce, enthrall, mold, command, or coerce our inner will or conscience or inspiration to its own uses. Just a few closing comments. I want to point out here that we are back to volition and therefore back to Nietzsche. However, a Nietzsche who might look very different from the prophet of affirmation, which Phillips's account of the contingent self brought to my mind. Or is it different? For the inner compulsion, which Duncan cautions against here, might itself be a form of the volition to which he also appeals. Where does one begin and the other end? That is, again, what is it that takes to the streets? And what is the relationship between individual action and the common good? In a discussion of Lacan, Marxism, determinism, and the potential for revolutionary subjective action, Joseph Valenti very astutely observes, Marxism requires an account of the insertion of subjectivity within the prevailing mechanism as something other than a free agent or a simple arm of the machine. In short, it requires a subjectivity seen as fully intentionalized contingency. This is what Marxism has to figure out. Finding Pound on his head and standing him on his feet again, might this be what Duncan means by volition? That's one of my final questions. I have one more. In lapidary comments on Guy Debord from his 1990 book, The Coming Community, Giorgio Agamben asserts that Debord's most important legacy is his understanding of the spectacle as, above all, language. But according to Agamben, this very reification of language as spectacle also means that our era is the first in which it is possible for, and this is Agamben, the first in which it is possible for humans to experience their own linguistic being, Not this or that content of language, but language itself. Not this or that true proposition, but the very fact that one speaks. Can psychoanalysis and poetry be on the vanguard of letting these structures take to the streets? That's it.